Now let me tell you about Nexus Prime. If you think your local spaceport is a den of thieves and cutthroats, well, you clearly have never been to this particular corner of galactic civilization, and I use the term civilization very, very loosely here. My name is Mortyn, and I am what you might generously call a trader. Less generously, you might call me a survivor. 6 arms, 4 eyes, and absolutely zero courage when it comes to actual confrontation. The Kelvarian species is not exactly known for our warrior spirit. We are more of the hide behind larger aliens and hope for the best type. Nexus Prime sits at the intersection of 7 major trade routes, which makes it incredibly profitable for business. It also makes it incredibly dangerous for anyone who is not 7 feet tall and covered in natural armor. The station operates under what the administrators laughably call free market principles. What this actually means is that whoever has the biggest weapons gets to charge whatever they want for protection. And speaking of protection, let me introduce you to Moran. Picture, if you will, a walking mountain of muscle and bad attitude. Galactians are naturally built like living siege engines, but Moran takes it to an artistic level. He stands 8 feet tall, weighs approximately 3 times what any reasonable being should weigh, and has skin that looks like it was carved from granite by someone who was really angry at granite. Moran runs what he calls a security consultation business on level 7. What this means in practical terms is that he walks around demanding payment from smaller species for the privilege of breathing his air. And since station security consists of exactly 2 underpaid Zentorians who spend most of their time hiding in Storage Bay 12, Moran pretty much has free rein to terrorize whoever he wants. Which brings me to the human. Now, I had heard rumors about humans, of course. Every trader worth his shipping manifest has heard the stories, but seeing one in person was something entirely different. Amy Kowalski sat cross-legged on the deck, plating near docking bay 42, completely absorbed in repairing what looked like a plasma conduit regulator. She had these strange, thin limbs that looked like they might snap if you looked at them wrong. Her skin was this odd pinkish color, and she had this bizarre fur growing only on the top of her head. What struck me as particularly odd was how every other being on the station seemed to give her a ridiculously wide berth. Vecthurian merchants who normally shoulder their way through crowds like they own the place would take long detours around her work area. Even the Zentorian dock workers, who fear absolutely nothing in the known universe, would find sudden urgent business elsewhere whenever she appeared. This made no sense to me whatsoever. The human looked about as threatening as a slightly upset flower. She barely came up to my shoulder, and I am not exactly what you would call imposing. Her tools were standard engineering equipment, nothing that could remotely be considered weaponry. She wore simple work coveralls that had seen better decades, and she hummed quietly to herself while she worked. Excuse me. I finally worked up the courage to ask a passing Thrukari dock supervisor. Why does everyone avoid the human? The supervisor looked at me like I had just asked why fire was hot. You are new here, are you not? Well, yes, but... Advice, friend trader. Do not bother the human while she works. Do not make sudden movements around the human. And most importantly, he leaned closer, all 6 of his eyes focusing on me with uncomfortable intensity. Do not, under any circumstances, touch the human without permission. Before I could ask what possible harm this small, quiet engineer could pose to anyone, the supervisor scurried away like his tail was on fire. So naturally, I decided to observe from what I considered a safe distance. Amy Kowalski continued her work with methodical precision, occasionally pausing to wipe sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. She seemed completely oblivious to the invisible bubble of terror she apparently generated just by existing. That was when Moran decided to have the worst day of his considerably long and violent life. Now, I should mention that Moran is not exactly what you would call intellectually gifted. If brains were credits, he would be permanently bankrupt. But what he lacks in mental capacity, he more than makes up for in sheer boneheaded stubbornness and an impressive ability to make catastrophically bad decisions. On this particular day, Moran came swaggering down the corridor like he owned the entire sector, which, to be fair, he pretty much did. His massive boots made the deck plating ring with each step, and smaller aliens practically threw themselves into maintenance alcoves to get out of his way. He had that special swagger that only comes from never having met anyone capable of putting you in your place. He stopped directly in front of Amy Kowalski, casting a shadow over her work area that could have eclipsed a small moon. "You," he rumbled in that voice that sounded like grinding stone, "owe me credits." Amy did not look up from her plasma conduit. She continued making delicate adjustments to the power coupling with the kind of focused concentration you normally see in bomb disposal experts. "I am sorry," she said in this perfectly pleasant voice, "but I do not believe we have conducted any business together." "We are conducting business now," Moran declared, clearly pleased with what he probably thought was clever wordplay. "This is my station. You breathe my air. That means you pay the human breathing tax." I have to give Amy credit here. She did not laugh, even though the concept of a human breathing tax was possibly the most ridiculous thing I had ever heard. And trust me, I once listened to a Valekarian politician explain economic policy for 3 hours. "That is very creative," Amy replied, still not looking up. "However, I must respectfully decline. The atmospheric processing fees are already included in my docking permit." Moran blinked slowly, the way beings do when they encounter concepts too complex for their limited processing power. "You decline?" "Yes, thank you." Now at this point, any reasonable individual would have recognized that they were dealing with someone who was either completely insane or completely confident. Amy Kowalski displayed the kind of calm that you usually only see right before something explosive happens. Her hands never stopped working. Her voice never changed tone. She might as well have been discussing the weather on some peaceful agricultural world. But Moran, as I mentioned, was not reasonable. He was the kind of being who interpreted politeness as weakness and calm as fear. This was about to become a very expensive mistake. "Nobody declines, Moran," he bellowed, loud enough to rattle the overhead lighting. "You pay or I teach you respect." Amy finally looked up from her work. She had these oddly colored eyes, sort of a blue-green mixture that reminded me of deep ocean water. When she focused those eyes on Moran, something changed in the air around them. It was subtle, but unmistakable, like the moment right before a thunderstorm breaks. "I understand you are upset," she said with the same pleasant tone she might use to order breakfast. "However, I really do need to finish this repair work. Perhaps we could discuss this later." What happened next will probably be talked about in trading posts across the galaxy for the next century. Moran, in what I can only describe as a moment of supreme cosmic stupidity, reached down and grabbed a handful of Amy Kowalski's hair. Let me be very clear about this. He grabbed her hair with his hand, on purpose. I actually felt my 4 hearts stop beating for a moment. The entire docking bay went silent except for the background hum of the station's life support systems. Even the automated cargo loaders seemed to pause in horrified anticipation. Amy looked down at the massive hand tangled in her hair. She looked back up at Moran's face, and then she smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. What happened in the next 2 seconds redefined my understanding of physics, biology, and the fundamental nature of the universe itself. Amy Kowalski moved with a speed that should not have been possible for any organic being. One moment she was sitting cross-legged on the deck plating, smiling that terrifying smile. The next moment her hand had wrapped around Moran's wrist with the precision of a mechanical vise. "Oh dear," she said in that same cheerful voice, as if she had just noticed a minor calibration error in her equipment. "You really should not have done that." Moran tried to pull his hand back. This was his first indication that something had gone very, very wrong with his day. His arm, which was roughly the size of my entire torso, did not move even a millimeter. Amy held his wrist with what appeared to be minimal effort, the way you might hold a tool while considering your next move. "You see," Amy continued, her voice taking on the tone of a patient instructor, "humans have what we call dense bone structure. Our skeletal system evolved under higher gravity than most species experience. This means our bones are approximately 40% denser than what you might consider normal." She adjusted her grip slightly. Moran's expression shifted from confused anger to dawning concern. Additionally, Amy went on, as if she were conducting a fascinating science lecture, human muscle fibers are arranged in overlapping bundles that can generate considerably more force per square centimeter than most biological systems. We also have this wonderful thing called adrenaline. I watched in absolute horror and fascination as Amy began to slowly, methodically increase the pressure on Moran's wrist. The Gorethian's face went through several interesting color changes as he realized that his hand was effectively trapped. Adrenaline is quite remarkable, really, Amy explained, sounding genuinely enthusiastic about the topic. When humans perceive a threat, our bodies release this chemical compound that temporarily increases our strength, speed and pain tolerance by factors that most species would find biologically impossible. The sound that came from Moran's wrist was like breaking kindling, a sharp, decisive crack that echoed through the docking bay with crystalline clarity. Moran's roar of pain could probably be heard 3 levels up. "Oh my," Amy said, examining the angle at which Moran's hand was now hanging. "That does not look right at all. I do hope that was not important for your daily activities." The crowd that had been watching from a safe distance suddenly decided that their current distance was nowhere near safe enough. Thrakari dock workers vanished into maintenance shafts. Zentarian cargo handlers found urgent business in entirely different sectors. A group of Vactharian merchants simply turned around and walked away so fast they were practically running. I, being apparently suicidal, stayed exactly where I was. I could not move. I was witnessing something that would fundamentally change how I viewed the galaxy, and I was not about to miss a single moment of it. Moran was now on his knees, cradling his broken wrist and making sounds that no being should ever have to make. Amy released his hand with the casual indifference of someone dropping a broken tool. "Now, the truly fascinating thing about human evolution," she continued, settling back into her cross-legged position, as if nothing unusual had happened, is that we developed what scientists call a fight-or-flight response. When threatened, our nervous system makes a very rapid decision about whether to run away or eliminate the threat. She picked up her plasma spanner and returned to her work on the conduit, humming softly to herself. "Today, for example, my nervous system assessed the situation and determined that running away would be impractical, since I have this repair work to complete, so it selected the alternative option." Moran was trying to say something through his pain, but it was coming out as more of a whimpering sound than actual words. "The really interesting part," Amy added, making a delicate adjustment to the power coupling, "is that humans often do not realize how much force we are actually applying until after the adrenaline wears off. It is a bit like having a safety override that gets disconnected during emergencies." She glanced up at Mortyn with genuine concern. "You should probably get that looked at. Station Medical is on level 5. Take the express lift. It will be faster." Moran stumbled to his feet, still clutching his wrist, and staggered away without saying another word. I do not think his brain had finished processing what had just happened to him. Amy watched him go with the same polite interest you might show to a mildly entertaining street performance. "Such a nice fellow," she commented. "I do hope he finds someone to help him with that wrist. Compound fractures can be tricky if they are not treated promptly." She returned to her humming and her repair work, as if she had not just casually demolished the most feared enforcer on Nexus Prime. That was when I realized that every single story I had ever heard about humans had been dramatically, catastrophically understated. Now you would think that having your wrist turned into a collection of bone fragments would be enough to convince most reasonable beings to reconsider their life choices. But as I have established, Moran was not exactly burdened with an excess of intelligence. About 10 minutes later, just as Amy was putting the finishing touches on her plasma conduit repair, Moran returned. He was wearing a medical brace on his wrist, and had brought friends, 3 friends, to be specific. All Gorathians, all roughly the size of industrial freight haulers. "That," Amy observed mildly, looking up from her work, "seems excessive." Moran pointed at her with his good hand, his face twisted into an expression of rage that would have sent most species running for the nearest airlock. "Nobody breaks Moran's bones and gets away with it. Nobody. I rather thought I already had gotten away with it, Amy replied with genuine confusion. Your wrist is broken. You left. I continued my work. That seems fairly conclusive to me. The three backup Gorathians spread out in what they probably thought was a tactical formation. To me it looked more like they were preparing to stomp on a particularly stubborn insect. Each of them was armed with shock prods, impact hammers, and what appeared to be enough raw muscle mass to demolish a small building. Amy set down her tools with the same careful precision she had shown throughout this entire encounter. She stood up slowly, brushing dust off her coveralls, and then did something that nearly made me fall over in shock. She stretched. Not the kind of stretching you do when you are preparing for combat. The kind of stretching you do when you are getting ready for your morning exercise routine. She rolled her shoulders, flexed her fingers, and twisted her spine with a series of small popping sounds. You know, she said conversationally, I was just reading a fascinating article about kinetic energy transfer in biological systems. Would you like to hear about it? The largest of the backup Gorathians, a specimen who made Moran look positively petite, charged first. He swung his impact hammer in an arc that should have reduced Amy to a fine paste. Amy stepped sideways. The hammer missed her by approximately 2 centimeters and buried itself in the deck plating with enough force to crack the reinforced metal. While the Gorathian was trying to extract his weapon, Amy grabbed his arm and used his own momentum to send him flying into a nearby cargo container. Kinetic energy, she explained cheerfully as the Gorathian slumped unconscious against the dented container, is equal to 1/2 the mass of an object multiplied by the square of its velocity. The fascinating thing is that you can redirect existing kinetic energy rather than generating new energy yourself. The second Gorathian came at her with a shock prod, crackling with enough electrical current to stop a charging rhino. Amy caught his wrist twisted in a way that made my spine hurt just watching, and suddenly the Gorathian was on the ground screaming, while his own shock prod delivered its full charge directly to his nervous system. Of course, Amy continued, as if she were conducting a university lecture, the real key is understanding leverage and fulcrum points. Most species do not realize that superior size can actually be a disadvantage if your opponent understands basic physics. At this point, I felt like I was watching one of those nature documentaries about apex predators. You know, the ones where they show a seemingly harmless creature systematically dismantling much larger prey through superior tactics and evolutionary advantages. Except this was happening right in front of me, and the predator was humming while she worked. The third Gorathian had apparently learned something from watching his companions get demolished, because he tried a more cautious approach. He circled Amy slowly, shock prod extended, looking for an opening. Amy waited patiently in the center of his circle, hands clasped behind her back like a teacher waiting for a student to work out a particularly difficult math problem. The thing about adrenaline, she said, is that it also enhances reaction time and spatial awareness. Right now, for example, I can track your movement, calculate the optimal angle of approach, and predict your next 3 possible actions. The Gorathian lunged. Amy ducked under his swing, came up behind him and somehow managed to wrap her arms around his massive neck. There was a brief struggle, and then the Gorathian went limp and collapsed like a deflated balloon. Carotid artery compression, Amy explained helpfully, temporarily restricts blood flow to the brain. Completely harmless if applied correctly, though I imagine he will have quite a headache when he wakes up. Moran was now staring at the unconscious forms of his 3 companions with an expression that suggested his worldview was undergoing some rather significant revisions. Amy brushed her hands off and picked up her tools. Now then, she said brightly, where were we? The medical team arrived approximately 3 minutes later, which was actually quite impressive response time for Nexus Prime. Usually it took Station Medical at least 10 minutes to respond to anything short of a complete hull breach. The lead medic, a competent-looking Thrakari with the kind of expression that suggested she had seen everything the galaxy had to offer, took one look at the scene and sighed deeply. Human? She asked, though it was clearly not really a question. Yes, Amy replied cheerfully. I am afraid there was a small misunderstanding about local tax policies. The medic began checking the vital signs of the unconscious Garathians with the weary efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Injuries? 1 compound fracture of the wrist, 1 probable concussion, 1 electrical shock trauma, and 1 case of temporary oxygen deprivation to the brain, Amy recited like she was reading from a shopping list. Oh, and some minor bruising. Nothing that should cause permanent damage. What happened next completely redefined my understanding of the situation. Amy Kowalski, the same being who had just systematically dismantled 4 heavily armed enforcers, rolled up her sleeves and began helping the medical team treat her victims. And I do mean helping. She was not just standing around offering moral support. She was actively assisting with medical procedures, stabilizing fractures, checking neural responses, and providing detailed explanations of exactly what she had done to each patient and why. The wrist fracture is clean, she explained to the medic while carefully immobilizing Moran's arm. I applied pressure along the natural stress points of the bone structure to ensure minimal tissue damage. The break should heal properly with standard osteo-regeneration therapy. The medic nodded appreciatively. Good technique. You have medical training? Engineering, mostly. But you pick up quite a bit of anatomy when you study kinetic systems and structural mechanics. I was still trying to process this when Commander Tom Marley arrived. Tom Marley was the closest thing Nexus Prime had to legitimate authority, a grizzled Zentarian, who had been running station security for longer than most species had been spacefaring. He took one look at the scene, made some notes on his datapad, and walked directly over to Amy. "Miss Kowalski," he said with the tone of someone greeting an old acquaintance. "I trust everything has been resolved satisfactorily?" "Oh yes," Amy replied, not looking up from bandaging the unconscious Garathian. "Just a small educational demonstration about human biology and conflict resolution principles." Commander Marley nodded, as if this was exactly what he had expected to hear. "Excellent. I will make sure these gentlemen understand the station's position on harassment of human personnel." That was when it hit me. The commander already knew about Amy. He already knew about humans. This was not some unprecedented incident that would send shockwaves through the galactic community. This was apparently just another Tuesday on Nexus Prime. "Commander, I finally worked up the courage to ask exactly how many humans are working on this station." "Currently, 12 engineers, 3 medical technicians, 1 administrative specialist, and 2 cargo handlers," he replied without consulting his datapad. "All excellent employees. Very polite, very professional. Absolutely no trouble whatsoever." He paused and looked meaningfully at the pile of unconscious Garathians. "As long as you do not bother them while they are working." Amy finished securing the last bandage and stood up, wiping her hands on a clean cloth. "I really should get back to my plasma conduit," she said apologetically. "These repairs need to be completed before the next shift rotation." As the medical team loaded the Garathians onto stretchers and hauled them away, Commander Marley turned to address the small crowd of aliens who had been watching from what they had thought was a safe distance. "Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted beings," he announced in his official voice, "let this serve as a reminder that Nexus Prime operates under strict non-harassment policies. This is particularly important when dealing with human personnel, who are, as you can see, quite capable of enforcing these policies independently." He gestured toward Amy, who was once again sitting cross-legged and humming while she worked on her plasma conduit. "Humans are remarkably peaceful beings," Commander Marley continued. "They prefer collaborative solutions to conflicts. They are unfailingly polite in their interactions, and they have an admirable dedication to their work. However, they also happen to be the most efficient combat specialists in known space." I felt my entire worldview shifting like tectonic plates. "You mean this is normal?" "Oh yes," Commander Marley said with what might have been amusement. "Humans have this wonderful saying, speak softly and carry a big stick. The fascinating thing is that they are the big stick." As Commander Marley wandered off to file his incident report, I found myself standing alone in the docking bay, with Amy Kowalski, who had returned to her plasma conduit repair, as if the last 20 minutes had been nothing more than a minor interruption in her work schedule. The silence stretched between us for several minutes, broken only by her quiet humming and the occasional spark from her welding tool. Finally, my curiosity overcame my sense of self-preservation. "Miss Kowalski," I ventured carefully, "may I ask you something?" "Of course," she replied without looking up from her work. "Though I should warn you that I am not particularly interesting to talk to. I mostly just fix things." "You just fix things?" "Well, yes. Broken equipment, damaged systems, occasional misunderstandings about personal boundaries." She made a delicate adjustment to the power coupling. "I find that most problems have practical solutions if you approach them with the right tools and sufficient application of basic principles." I thought about this for a moment, and the right tools for dealing with aggressive enforcers would be human anatomy, mostly, though a solid understanding of physics helps quite a bit. She finally looked up at me with those unsettling blue-green eyes. "You know, Mortyn, I have been working on stations like this for almost 3 years now, and I have noticed something interesting." "What is that?" "Most species make the same mistake Moran made. They assume that smaller means weaker, that polite means helpless, that different means inferior." She set down her tools and stretched again, though this time it was clearly just to work out a crick in her back rather than preparation for violence. "The thing is," she continued, "every species in this galaxy has evolved specific advantages for survival. Kelvarians like yourself have incredible multitasking abilities and spatial reasoning skills. Thrakari have enhanced sensory perception and analytical thinking. Zentarians have natural leadership capabilities and strategic intelligence." She gestured around the docking bay, where normal station activity was slowly resuming now that the excitement was over. "Humans evolved as persistence hunters on a high-gravity world with an oxygen-rich atmosphere. This gave us dense bones, efficient cardiovascular systems, and neurological wiring that prioritizes problem-solving under pressure. We are essentially biological engineering solutions to the problem of survival." Amy packed up her tools with the same methodical care she had shown throughout this entire encounter. "The mistake most beings make is assuming that because we look different or act differently, we must be weak. But evolution does not create weak species, Mortyn. It creates specialists." As she prepared to leave, she paused and looked back at me with what might have been genuine concern. "If you take anything away from today's events, I hope it will be this. Treat every being you meet with respect, regardless of how they look or how harmless they might seem. You never know what evolutionary advantages they might be carrying around in their biology." Within 6 hours, new signs had appeared throughout Nexus Prime. They were posted in 17 different languages and featured simple, clear guidelines for appropriate interaction protocols with human personnel. The first rule was printed in letters large enough to be read from orbit. "Do not touch humans without explicit permission." I made a mental note to add my own personal addendum, especially do not touch their hair. Trust me on this one. 6 months later, I was walking through the same docking bay when I witnessed something that perfectly summarized everything I had learned about humans and the fundamental irony of galactic politics. There was Moran, the former terror of Level 7, carefully handing tools to Amy Kowalski while she performed routine maintenance on a cargo hauler's navigation array. His wrist had healed perfectly, and he now wore a work badge identifying him as Assistant Engineer, Level 2. "Plasma spanner, please," Amy requested politely. "Yes, Miss Amy," Moran replied with the kind of respectful tone I had never heard from him before. "The 7mm or the 12mm? 7 will be fine, thank you." As I watched this former enforcer turned helpful assistant, I realized that Amy had accomplished something that years of station security and administrative policies had failed to achieve. She had reformed Moran simply by demonstrating that there were consequences for antisocial behavior. These days, humans on Nexus Prime enjoy what can only be described as unofficial protection status. Not because of any formal policy, but because word had spread through the station's underworld that bothering human workers was what we call a career-limiting decision. When new traders arrive on the station, I make it a point to offer them the same advice that Thrakari supervisor gave me: be polite to humans, do not make sudden movements around humans, and never ever touch humans without permission. But I also add my own personal wisdom. Humans are the most genuinely pleasant, helpful, and courteous beings you will ever meet in this galaxy. They are also the most thoroughly dangerous. Amy Kowalski still sits in that same spot, near Docking Bay 42, still hums while she works, and still treats everyone with the same unfailing politeness she showed on that memorable day 6 months ago. She remains without question the most terrifying individual on Nexus Prime. And that is exactly how she likes it.